Hey everybody, this is Dave. Welcome back to the channel. Today I am bringing you my high-level thoughts and takeaways from Rocket Lab's Q4 earnings call. We got a lot of great information. We've had a little bit of time to have it percolate, think about it, and come to some thoughts and conclusions on what's important for the stock, for the company, for the future of what they're doing, and whether this is good or bad, and love to hear your thoughts as well. Sorry this took a couple days longer than expected, but life does tend to get in the way. We've had quite a turbulent few days on the market, so I hope you're handling the rough ride okay. Looks like we are up today again, but it's been up and down and definitely big moves every day. So hopefully you guys, if you are shareholders in Rocket Lab, have been handling this all right. On the big red days, personally, I find it helps to just zoom out and look at the bigger picture. We're going to talk a little bit about the bigger picture as well for the company today. I did also do a live stream of the earnings call, so thank you to everyone who tuned in with me and talked about the results live. However, that was a 2-hour long event, so I don't blame you at all if you don't have time to watch through that full thing. The most important points we are going to talk about today. Okay, before we dive into that, please do consider hitting that subscribe button if you haven't already subscribed to the channel. It would be very much appreciated, and if you are already a subscriber, thank you so much for doing that. Okay, let's dive into Rocket Lab's Q4 results and guidance for 2025. Okay, let's start off with the high-level numbers, and then we'll get into some of the more juicy details later on. Starting off with the revenue for the quarter, we did have $132.4 million. By the way, if you watched my earnings preview video, my prediction was 132, so pretty happy about that prediction, almost right on. And the guidance previously had been 125 to 135, so I give them a nice green check mark there as they are towards the upper end of their guidance. Similarly, non-GAAP gross margin, they'd guided 32 to 34%. They are at the top of that range at 34%. Non-GAAP operating expenses, they said 84 to, this must be a typo, I think it was 84 to $86 million. And we had about $74.5 million, so coming in under the operating expenses, which is also nice. Adjusted EBITDA loss, they were guiding for $27 to $29 million in adjusted EBITDA losses, which is, of course, earnings before interest, depreciation, and amortization is added in. And the loss was actually a little bit less than that, with negative $23.2 million. So great to see that they lost less on that adjusted EBITDA basis than they had been previously telling us they might. Really, though, I think the high level for this year is we're looking towards the future. So whether they beat or miss these numbers by a few $1 million either way is not really as important as what they're saying about the future and the building blocks they're putting in place for the future growth of the company. So let's continue on here. Full year results, $436.2 million, gross profit, $116 million, net loss as they're still burning cash to build out that Neutron project and several other projects they have on the go we'll talk about later on. Investing for the future, $109 million, so that's something to keep an eye on. Zooming out to Rocket Lab's revenue growth, and this is going back to the pre-SPAC days as they went public around 2021, looks pretty good. So obviously, the growth number from 2023 to 2024, very strong. They had that big step up in revenue growth 2021 to 2022 when they made those acquisitions. So they, several 100% growth. But overall, long term, I like the chart going up and to the right. Of course, it's always going to be lumpy, and we're going to talk about that some more later on, as well as projections for 2025. But trending in the right direction and strong growth numbers. So when I look at these SPAC companies, I like to go back to what they said they were going to do when they went public. So many of these companies, especially space companies, got nowhere near close to what they said they were going to do. And I find that incredibly disappointing and find it hard to trust what they're going to say in the future when they, make these wild claims that turn out to be so far off base. So going back to Rocket Lab's 2021 SPAC deck, They projected that they would be doing about $450 million in 2024. And the actual number here, $436.2 million. So very close, like under 14 million off. And this is obviously 3 years out. So I think this deserves a bit of a round of applause, to be honest, that they actually executed on this chart, which looks like massive growth, and they're mostly on track here. Looking at the numbers side by side now, another chart I made. So in red, we have the actual revenue numbers they've done, and in blue, their SPAC projections. And they did trail a little bit 2021. 2022 was actually a great year, and they did even better than they projected. 2023, again, trailing a little bit, but still in the right ballpark. And 2024, closing ground, still trailing a little bit. But when you're this close, I really do give you a pass on that, as long as they're kind of in the range. Compare this to a company like Virgin Galactic, and I'm sorry to call out Virgin here, but I think they were just so off base that it was unfair to shareholders. When they went public, they said they would do $31 million in 2020, $210 million in 2021, $398 million in 2022, and $590 million of revenue in 2023. What do they actually have in 2023? $6.8 billion or $6.8 million, barely a little sliver that you would see on this chart. So Rocket Lab executing against what they said they would do versus some of these other SPACs didn't. If you're another company that is executing on what you said you were going to do when you went public, you do have my respect. So Electron launches now. We do know that in 2024, they had 16 launches, so a little bit lumpy. And yes, we did have, a down year 2021 with COVID. 2023, we thought we were going to have more growth, but we had that anomaly that caused a delay and the rocket got grounded for several months. But growth seems to be back on track here with 16 launches on the year. Yes, originally at the start of the year, we were hoping 20 plus, but customers didn't end up being ready. I still think 16 on 10 is pretty solid growth numbers, and we're really hoping that will grow in the future. So yeah, good growth with Electron, still trending in the right direction despite those SpaceX transporter and bandwagon rideshare missions that get a lot of press. Looks like Rocket Lab still does have customers. Speaking of Electron, on the earnings day, they did announce a new multi-launch deal with IQPS. This is a company that already had 4 launches signed with Electron, and they signed 4 more to bring a total of 8 launches for their constellation. Clearly, they seem to be happy with the responsive service Rocket Lab provides and having dedicated launch as opposed to rideshare. So yeah, just another good sign for demand for Electron, especially like to see the multi-launch deals as opposed to the one-offs. I think it shows that, these customers return and they do think that Rocket Lab is their best option. Quoting the earnings call, Peter Beck talking about Electron and their demand, really pointing out HASTE, saying that last year's Pentagon budget request for hypersonic research was up 46% on the 2 years prior, and we're ideally positioned to support this expanding market. So I do think that HASTE will be a very big growth driver for Electron going forward, as we saw that massive Kratos deal for $1.45 billion, and Rocket Lab, key partner on that. So a lot of eyes on HASTE as we look at Electron's continued growth, and that is kind of the most exciting area of Electron for me in terms of revenue growth. For 2025 now, the company is saying that they're planning 20 or more missions. So yeah, 16 in 2024, 20 in 2025. I'd categorize that as solid growth, but not outstanding. The thing is, though, I think Rocket Lab is really kind of sandbagging here, or they just want to play it safe. And even Peter said later in the Q&A section, he said, I think we're just being a little bit more cautious this year because we had a big manifest last year and we launched everything that turned up and we still fell short significantly of what we thought we were going to do. So I think we're going to look at more than 20 launches by the end of the year if everything does end up turning up to the launch pad. And I think they are playing this very safe, and internally they probably expect the real number to be, much higher than 20, but they're just frankly sick of missing on the guidance because customers aren't ready, and I can't blame them because I think we're all sick of that. So even Adam Spice in a recent conference said the manifest supports well over 20 launches, which is a bit of a different language than more than 20 launches. I'm thinking they might do 23, 24 launches this year, which would be great growth and, obviously a great beat. So that's kind of my thoughts, even though they're saying only 20. Let me know what you think. Would you be happy with 20 launches on the year? Do you think they're going to get 22, 23, 24, 25, even higher? Interested to hear your guys' take on that. But no matter what, we are looking at Electron growth. This was cool, not actually in the earnings call, but I did want to just kind of point it out. Work continuing on the Venus probe. Cool little image here of the probe Rocket Lab is planning to send to Venus to search for signs of life. And I think it's an amazing mission that brings Rocket Lab a lot of attention. And if whatever they find, it will be interesting. So really excited to see that mission launch, hopefully 26, I believe. The company is doubling down that this is the year of Neutron, which is extremely important. Going into the earnings call, the most important thing that was on my mind was Neutron's timeline, whether they're still going to get the launch off in 2025 and what month of 2025. So they do say now that the debut launch is scheduled for the second half of 2025 in Neutron. And they're, saying big words, this is the year of Neutron. Going to the Q&A section later on, because this language did change slightly. And Edison Yu from, I think it's Deutsche Bank he's with, did ask about this. So he said in the past it's been talked about as mid-2025. Now you're saying second half. Is this a delay? Is it just kind of a changing in wording? And Peter basically said, we're giving ourselves a little bit more time to get it to the pad and get the launch, but we're talking months here. It's not very material. It's not like a huge amount of time. So this does count as a Neutron delay, probably a couple months delay versus what they were hoping for before. If you watched my predictions video at the start of the year, I did say I was thinking about a launch in October, whereas I know they were guiding for more like mid-year, so maybe June, July-ish. I'm still hoping for October, November. I think if they get the launch off in 2025, as long as that happens, I'll be happy. If it gets delayed into 2026, that's when I won't be happy. So very important. And this has such a big impact on the earnings because every quarter that goes by and Neutron hasn't launched, they're spending a lot of money on the development of that rocket. So that's more money being spent for no revenue yet. But there are some good signs. We saw a lot of interesting things from Neutron in the earnings call. So Neutron launch site nearing completion, one of the biggest items for being able to launch. They do say that the launch site is scheduled to be open for Q2 2025, which I think basically means that it is not the holdup for Neutron. If it's going to be ready in Q2, we're looking at more like Q3 in my mind, or even Q4 for the actual launch. So nice to see Neutron Launchpad shaping up, and nice to know that I don't think it is the holdup on this whole thing. We did have some quotes here where Peter basically said at Launch Complex 3, all major hardware and infrastructure items have arrived and been installed, and our civil works on the site are practically finished. Yes, and we even have water. Now, this water quote is in reference to the recent Bleecker Street short seller report, where they basically floated the idea that Rocket Lab may not be able to launch Neutron because they may not be able to get access to water at the site for the deluge system that basically pumps a bunch of water under the rocket as it launches to protect the concrete and ground infrastructure from damage and those loud acoustic vibrations. So he's kind of calling out the report here in an underhanded way, saying, yes, we even do have water. Most recent updates include the flare stack, 165 tons steel circular launch mount that we've seen previously and have talked about, and a giant pair of liquid natural gas tanks on the bottom left. So What's left to complete now is just some electrical and mechanical connections for a fully integrated system, but otherwise we look forward to its grand opening in a few short months. So that's an exciting point for Neutron's progress. Good to see that. Also, Neutron's structures and the actual rocket itself starting to come together. We got a very cool video of Peter Beck and the Hungry Hippo fairing in action. So we saw these fairings previously, but now they are actually opening and closing. The massive reusable nose cone halves are now live and moving, fully integrated with their avionics and actuators and all of the mechanical systems. And Rocket Lab is testing like they're flying, opening and closing the Hungry Hippo at full speed to understand exactly how it will behave. And we have Peter getting eaten by the Hungry Hippo. And he said it was, great sound to hear in action, and encourages everyone to check out the video on their Twitter feed. Very cool stuff and, a key part of the rocket. Obviously, they're one of their big differentiators that they do keep those fairings attached to the rocket and bring them back to ground. Now, likewise, for some of the larger hardware items for Neutron, they did say that 100% of Neutron flight hardware is in production, which is great news because basically every part of the Neutron flight hardware for that first flight is being built right now. Once qualification is complete, the next step is the assembly and integration. So qualification, if you're not familiar with it, is basically qualifying and approving that design, and you test out the design and it's working as you expected, and the manufacturing process is qualified and everything is fine. These structures are being produced in parallel, so all at the same time, not one at a time, getting ready for that first launch. And they're even working on hardware for the second launch, which is exciting to hear. So not stopping anytime soon and even moving on to hardware for the second Neutron, getting that ready to go. Archimedes engine qualification continues. We got some cool pictures. So they're getting a second test cell going, which will be right beside the first test cell here. And they can test two separate Archimedes engines side by side as they really want to ramp up the qualification campaign for Neutron. This extension nozzle here does go, I believe, on the bottom of a Archimedes engine. Other changes as well required to make a vacuum optimized Archimedes that will be used on the second stage outside of Earth's atmosphere. That was another thing I was looking for, is the vacuum optimized version of Archimedes. So there's some progress on that. And we saw previously that they were able to reduce the weight by 200 kilograms. I do think Archimedes, definitely something to keep an eye on, more even than, say, the ground infrastructure for sure, is we want to, make sure the design gets qualified. Now for a couple announcements that I did not see coming and I think are extremely exciting for Rocket Lab. First off is Neutron's landing platform. I had been wondering when we'd get news on their barge that they're planning to land Neutron on. Obviously, the first test launch is just going to be a hover slam into the ocean. So they don't need the barge for that, but they'll need it for potentially landings next year. And now we've gotten some information on the barge itself. They will have to do a bunch of work retrofitting this thing to get it ready to launch Neutron. The render at the bottom right there, what it will look like in the long term. But I think this is bullish too, personally, because sure, let's say they need a year to get this barge ready for service in terms of having rockets landing on it, taking them back to shore, all that. Well, if they were really secretly, like Bleecker Street report is saying, thinking Neutron might not launch until 26, 27, that means they wouldn't need the barge until 27 or 2028. You're really going to dump a ton of cash on a big marine asset that's expensive and have it sit around in port for a couple years if Neutron's not going to be ready. I don't think you'd do that. So I think this is a good sign to say that they do think Neutron will be having operational flights in 2026. Obviously, I'm not an expert on retrofitting barges, but that's just my sense of the timelines. Personally, let me know, as always, what you think about that. And the really big, interesting announcement here is Rocket Lab's new satellite bus. And this one I was not expecting at all. And I find it incredibly exciting. In a lot of ways, it's kind of similar to Starlink in that it's a very flat pack design. You can see a picture here of them packing a bunch of flatelites into a Neutron fairing. Now, this is just a render, but this is kind of what it would look like. And I think they could go even higher. So this is a scalable, resilient, high power, secure, low latency, high speed connectivity and remote sensing capability satellite. And it does look like kind of a constellation class satellite that you would be deploying in droves, kind of like Starlink. Peter Beck was asked about this on the Q&A in terms of what kind of manufacturing rate they were thinking about for Flatellite, or I like to call it FlatSat, I think, but Flatellite, FlatSat, whatever. The answer was a few per week to up to one per day. So I think like 365 per year type thing, which is, quite high volume for the company compared to their entire backlog of satellites at this point, I think is like 40 something. So definitely designed for mass manufacturing and very exciting, really, because it's also what they're going to be using for their own satellite constellation. You would even have the little paragraph here saying that it's a strategic move toward being truly end-to-end, operating their own constellation. So previously, as we looked at their spacecraft family, we had Photon, Pioneer, Lightning, and Explorer. Lightning, the biggest growth driver currently. This is what their Global Star MDA satellites are based on for Apple, as well as what the SDA satellites are based on. And I was kind of thinking Lightning might be the growth driver for the future in terms of their own constellation as well. I guess that's not the case here. So we have a new one. That means 5 satellites in Rocket Lab's spacecraft family. And interesting to hear more about comparing and contrast the different capabilities of, say, Lightning versus a Flatellite. Photon, I think there'll always be demand for that. Pioneer, I'm kind of curious about the future of Pioneer as we look towards the end of that Varda deal. But for me, Lightning and Flatellite, the two biggest, most important spacecraft Rocket Lab has in their family right now. On their website, a little bit more about Flatellite. They do kind of highlight low latency, high speed communications in LEO here. To me, they did also say remote sensing applications, for example. They could be used for Earth observation. But for me, connectivity is highlighted several times, and I think communications is where they're going with their own constellation. And again, it looks a lot like Starlink in terms of the flat design. Starlink is also primarily for communications, although they do in their Star Shield have some observation side of it. But yeah, I'm leaning more and more towards communications for Rocket Lab's own constellation. And I think it's fair to say that they've designed this satellite with Neutron in mind, meaning it'll be very efficient how many they can pack into a Neutron and use up a full Neutron's capacity. And I'm sure they've put a lot of thought into both sides of the equation, fitting the launch and the satellite together to work perfectly as a whole, which is obviously very important. Going on to some numbers here, we did talk about the revenue. That's a 78% growth rate year on year, which is obviously a great figure. Gross margin is increasing as well for the company, which is nice to see, driven by increased launch cadence on the quarter, although maybe a slightly less favorable mix for their space systems business. When we talk about backlog, I think there's a lot to go into here. So backlog as of the end of the quarter was $1.067 billion, 36% launch, 64% space systems. Interesting thing, and this quote, obviously very key, will be going back to that later, expecting to recognize 50% of that backlog over the next 12 months. Oh, by the way, guys, I am rocking my Space Company Owner shirt here. If you're interested in that, there should be a link to my little store down below the description. Some other shirts down there in case you're interested in. I'm always open to for more designs as long as they're not infringing on anyone's IP. If you have an idea for a t-shirt, I'd love to hear about it in the Discord server where we all hang out and talk. Okay, so about the backlog. End of Q3, it was $1.05 billion. End of Q4 is $1.067 billion. So almost flat, just a gain of about $10.2 million. There's one thing I would nitpick about this quarter. It's that I was kind of hoping we'd see a little bit more backlog growth because it's been flat for a little while now. Zooming out to their backlog, you can see there was a massive step up in 2023 versus 2022. That's because they signed the big SDA deal worth $500 million. Since then, a full year of the backlog being flat, unfortunately. It's not horrible. At least the backlog is still supporting their record growth that they delivered in 2024, 78% revenue growth, and they kept that backlog flat. It didn't shrink at all. So, that's a good sign that revenue isn't going to drop at all going forward next year. But you do kind of want to see the backlog continue to grow as a sign that the revenues will be continuing to grow as well in the future. So that's one thing I was kind of hoping we'd get some big contract announcement that would result in a big backlog increase that we didn't see. Hopefully we do get some more big contracts in 2025. We do know that it can be incredibly lumpy, right? So obviously one deal when you're talking about $500 million could be a massive step change in backlog. If you get another deal like that in 2025, you get another step change up for backlog. Things are looking golden. The trend is in the right direction. It's just a lumpy business with these big contracts. But we can learn some things that are interesting from this backlog. So Neutron's first contract was signed in Q4 of 2024. I do want to give props to Scott O. If you haven't checked out his channel, you might want to give it a look, or his Twitter as well. He did these calculations first. So yeah, Scott did this first, but I did want to share because I thought it was material. If you go to Rocket Lab's Q3 10Q form, you can see that their backlog was $326.4 million in launch. Now in the 10K form, after this quarter, we can see the backlog for launch is 386.3. What does that mean? The backlog relating to launch was increased by $59.9 million from quarter 3 to quarter 4. Now, we know that they did launch $42.4 million in revenue for the quarter. That's what they realized for launch. So that means the total of contracts signed in the quarter to make up for this, what they realized plus the increase, is $102.3 million. So trying to back out what they are getting for that first Neutron contract that they signed, we do know it's for 2 launches, and they only really signed one other Electron launch in the quarter. I'm not going to go into the details on that too much, but suffice it to say, one Electron launch, it's probably maybe a little higher ASP, but let's just say 8 million for argument, plus or minus 1 million. Maybe it's up to 9. Maybe I highly doubt it's much lower than, 7.5. But for the purposes of a Neutron, it's a good ballpark. So if you take 8 million out of this $102.3 million, you get 94.3, divide that by 2, you get about $47 million per Neutron. We know that they had been kind of advertising it as 50 to 55 million per launch. So some people looked at this and they were saying like, oh, that's bearish, it's less than 50 million. I think this is completely fine. First of all, this is a first customer launch, which is always risky. So usually there's discounts. Some companies massively discounting their rockets. You got New Glenn selling their first launch for 20 million when they plan to launch for over 100 million. So Rocket Lab giving a little bit of a discount on a first launch. And not only that, it's a bulk buy of 2 launches, not an individual launch. Usually when a company bulk buys Electron rockets, they'll get a little bit of a discount for buying more than one. So maybe they're passing along a little bit of a discount for that as well. I think this is completely in line, completely fine with a $47 million price tag on a first Neutron launch company, a customer accepting a little bit more risk even. And I don't see any problems with having that average price of a Neutron rise going forward. Let me know if you have a problem with a $47 million launch for their first customer down below. Always interested to hear as well. Okay. Continuing on with backlog, circling back to that quote in the presentation, they said remaining backlog totaled $1.067 billion. This is from, once again, the 10K. Approximately 50% expected to be recognized within 12 months. So what does this mean? Well, divide that by 2. 50% of that backlog is $533 million. So in essence, they're basically guiding for revenue of around this in 2025. And then you may say, well, what about contracts signed during the year? And I think this is fair because even more and more now for Electron, you're getting contracts signed and then launched within a very short period of time. So maybe there is some contracts signed and then revenue realized within the same year, meaning there could be some upside to this $533 million. I wanted to see a ballpark of how much though. So if you go back to 2023's Q4 call, we had similar wording or verbiage here, expecting to realize 41% of their backlog, which at that time was $1.046 billion. 41% of that was 428 million. 0.9. And they ended up making on the year, of course, $436.2 million. So there was a little bit of upside versus what they said. I guess you could base that. You could call it a beat, or you could call it they signed some contracts in the quarter, which made money on. Actually, this kind of works out well to the cost of one responsive Electron launch, because those responsive quick turnaround launches are a little bit more expensive. So there may be some room to, go up here, but this is kind of roughly around the guidance we're thinking for 2025. So going back to my spreadsheet where I kind of try to think out what I think they're going to do in the future, we can see 2025. The number I had in my head here or modeled out for 2025 was $557 million. The guidance here is about $533 million. So in the ballpark, but guidance is a little bit lower. Having said that, maybe we get a couple Electron contracts signed and launched during the same year. Maybe they have a little bit of a beat on this and things are a little bit higher and it's closer to the figure I was estimating. But at least nice to know I'm in the same ballpark. The other thing nice to see is that 2024 revenue numbers I had modeled out, and keep in mind my model justified like a pretty good stock price, and I was kind of buying the stock based on this model, albeit at lower levels. I was modeling about $415 million of revenue in 2024, and they did beat that with $436 million of revenue, which is a good sign. So I will be returning to this model very shortly, updating all the numbers based on what we've learned in this earnings call and, how we're thinking about Neutron and Flatellite and other things going forward. And do look out for that video because it's a very important one. But all in all, I would say things are kind of on track with what I had been modeling, plus or minus a given year, say a few percentage points on their revenue. Of course, gross margins, gross profits, all that thing is something else. I do think that one thing I probably got wrong in the model was 2025. I had them kind of getting closer to profitability, but since launch is now in 2025 and not 2024, the spend is actually higher in 2025 as they really push towards that Neutron launch. So a slight shift in terms of when they hit that profitability and when they start spending less and less, and we get, the march towards profitability, which is another thing I'm very excited for going forward. And we'll talk about that in that spreadsheet video that will be coming shortly. So if you look at what we're thinking now for revenue in 2025, this is kind of what we're guiding for. So what I did here on this chart is I took their number of 533 million and my number of 557 million. I kind of split the difference in case they might beat. So that's what you're seeing here in this chart. Solid growth, not bad, not amazing. I do have to say 2025 is really more of a setup year as they invest in the future, right? You're spending all this money on Neutron for the past few years. Neutron will hopefully launch in 2025, but that will not be a revenue-generating launch because that's a first test launch. So all that money you're spending does not bring in any revenue in this calendar year. Yes, we still have good growth in space systems and hopefully on Electron, but all the big push they've really been making and the big investments they've been making, not delivering the massive revenue growth in 2025. Hopefully we'll see that in 26 and beyond. So as we have a lumpy revenue growth, to me, this is another year kind of like 2023, right? Big step up from 2021 to 2022, modest growth from 22 to 23, another big step up. So I'm thinking this looks like a bit more modest growth, and then hopefully 26, maybe we get another big step up, 2 or 3 actual revenue generating Neutron launches go a very long way, as well as once you start getting a new satellite model in Flatellite going, start realizing more revenue on SDA and maybe get new contracts for space systems. Again, the 2 nitpicks I have for this earnings call is I was kind of hoping we might get a little bit more backlog growth and we might get a little bit more of those contracts from space systems. What this growth looks like charted out is obviously massive growth in 22, due in large part to those acquisitions they made in space systems, coming down to more reasonable levels in 23, which is 16%, a little lower than I'd like to see, but a big step up from 23 to 24, 78%. That's an outstanding number. 25% from 24 to 25, what I consider to be more of an okay number before hopefully we again see big growth in 26. At least that's what I'm thinking as we get Neutron and some of these other things going. But I'd love to hear your thoughts on that as well. So those are my thoughts and highlights for the quarter. Let me know what you thought down below. Sorry if it's a bit of a longer video, but we always get so much important news to go through on these earnings call. I will say overall, I thought the numbers for 2024 and Q4 itself were great. Guidance for 2025, maybe a little lighter than some people were hoping for in terms of continued revenue growth. I did talk about why that is, but maybe that had something to do with a bit of the stock weakness after the earnings call, as well as, macro concerns and the slight Neutron delay of maybe a couple months. As long as that happens again in 2025, I'm happy. And hopefully more aggressive growth beyond 25 as Neutron actually starts delivering revenue. Let me know your thoughts down below. Do look out for that discounted cash flow video I'll be coming out with soon as I go through all the numbers in even more detail and what kind of stock price I do think that these revenue growth and margin numbers will justify in the future. Excited for that one. Thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you have a great day. I hope you're dealing okay with the volatility in this market as the stock has been all over the place. And I will see you in the next video. Bye for now.